my first book, I made the mistake of reading it for Books on Tape. And when you read your own book in the broadcast out loud, you realize how boring your book is. And so I've never done that again. But I did get a story out of it, which was the sound engineer told me about another writer who was reading his book on tape. And he had written a 700-page novel. And so he was in the middle of reading it, and the sound engineer looks into the booth and sees the guy weeping. And he pushes the button and says, is there something I can help you with? And the guy says, don't I ever shut up? And so some of you may feel that about me right now. But I will try to be entertaining, or at least intersectional, which I guess is the word of the night. I didn't expect that to be here, but whatever. So as you probably know about me, I've written 4 or 5 books. I am a bookish person. I read a book when I was 7 called Paddington the Bear, and decided at that moment that I was going to be a writer. And I call that my enunciation moment. Writing has been central to my life ever since. I probably haven't gone 150 or 200 days without writing something, and all that time since. In high school, I wanted to date. I went to high school at a place called Radnor, and out of this table right here, 5 people lived in this town of Wayne, Pennsylvania. I wanted to date some woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were her values, and these were my values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which, as I mentioned, is a school where fun goes to die, a very writerly school. The kids wear T-shirts that say, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? So it's a writerly school, and I double majored there. I majored in history and celibacy while I was at Chicago. And I'm not like today's students. All my students are at Yale, do all these extracurriculars. It's like, what are you doing at spring break? Oh, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers, that sort of thing. But I did learn some skills, so my students also share the ability to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading. And so that was bookish. And then I went on and became a conservative columnist in the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I have a side career as a TV pundit. But I'm on the sort of the bookish end of TV punditry. I think I'm on a show called The News Hour. My partner, Mark Shields, we have a segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields. That would have been better. But and we have a certain audience, which is a seasoned and experienced demographic that we hit. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. So our marketing strategy, we're very big in the hospice community, which is a short-term audience, but committed. And so I do this thing with Mark, and Mark's been doing it for a good while. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks. It used to be called Shields and Shigo, and before that it was Shields and Gergen. Before that I think it was Shields and Coolidge. I think Shields and Thomas Aquinas is how it started. He's been doing it for a little while. But it's sort of cerebral and above the neck. I think as you get older, I've remained bookish, but hopefully I've gotten a little more sensitive, a little more feminine. I think it happens to a lot of guys in middle age. So I'm the only American man ever to have finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love. I actually read that whole book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote another book called The Social Animal, which was a book about emotion. And my friends all joke that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing about gluttony. It's like not the natural thing. And then finally, as Mark had mentioned earlier, about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I published a book called The Road to Character, which is a book about character formation. And I learned writing that book that writing a book about character doesn't actually give you good character. And even reading a book about character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book about character does give you good character. And so I recommend that. And so all this is to say that a lot of my life has been neck up. And yet, even now, I think as you get older, you realize that the brain, the rational part of the brain, is the third most important part of the consciousness. And the first, as St. Augustine would say, is the desiring heart. We're primarily desiring creatures, not thinking creatures. And I read about a guy a few years ago who bought a house with a bamboo stand by the driveway. And he chopped it down because he hated bamboo. And he chopped into the root system, and he poured plant poison in the hole. He filled it with 3 feet of gravel, and then several inches of concrete. And 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo coming up through the concrete. And in my view, we all have that in ourselves, which is our desire. We all are driven by certain desires. And if you go to a school play with a bunch of 8-year-olds and you see them on stage, you see them desiring with all their might to be good, to impress somebody, just to be right. And what we desire and what the heart desires above all is a sense of fusion and completion with another human being or other human beings. The kind of fusion that Louis de Bernier describes in a great book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In that book, he's got an old guy talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And the old guy says, "Love itself is what is left over when being in love has burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we discovered that we were one tree and not two." And I think that's what the heart wants. The second, or equal most important part of the faculty, which I don't have to tell people in this room, is the yearning soul. Now, normally I'm a secular writer, and I speak to secular audiences, and I don't ask them to believe in God or not. I don't think you need to believe in God to believe you have a soul. I think even if you're an atheist, you're secular, you still can understand the fact that there is some piece of you that has no size, shape, color, or weight, but gives you infinite value and dignity. That rich and successful people don't have more of this thing than poor and unsuccessful people, that old people don't have more of it than the young. But this thing gives you dignity and value and moral responsibility. A river is not morally responsible for what it does. A tiger is not morally responsible for what it eats. But a human being is morally responsible for what it does because it has this property in it. And that slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another human being's soul. And that rape is not just an attack on a series of physical molecules, it's an obliteration of another soul. And as Roger Scruton said, obscenity is defined as anything that covers another person's soul. Man is a metaphysical being, Jacques Maritain said, an animal that nourishes its life on transcendence. And what the soul does is it yearns for goodness. I've covered wars, met people who committed genocide, covered criminals. I've never met anybody who didn't want to be good. Every single person wants to lead a good life. And even if they do horrible things, they always invent some rationalization to explain why it was actually good. And what the soul yearns for is service to some transcendent ideal. And to experience the kind of fulfillment that Rabbi Wolf Kellman described when he crossed the bridge at Selma with Martin Luther King. We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest, most transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, and the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment. We were experiencing what Heschel called the meaning beyond the mystery. And so what I was hoping to talk to you tonight is about renewal. Last night, Ann and I talked about social renewal, about the renewal of society. But I was hoping to do a more personal internal renewal. How does spiritual formation happen internally? How do you awaken the heart and soul? We live in a culture that tends to want to bury these things under the pressure of career and time. How do you awaken these things? And obviously the first thing you do is just go to Fuller. But if it's too far away, my experience is that to awaken these things in their fullest, life often happens to have to break you. It has to break you first. Some people are broken and crushed, but others are broken open. And those, sometimes it's sweet to be broken open. You can be broken open by love, by the ferocious love of another person or of your child. And as Christian Wyman says, love has a tendency to be on the move. You fall in love with one thing, and love has a tendency to flow elsewhere, often to God. But sometimes it is seasons of suffering that breaks you open. My next book is called The Second Mountain. It's based on the idea that a lot of us graduate from college and we think we have our mountain to climb, which is a career and a family and the satisfactions of the ego. And then we get to the top of that mountain and find it unsatisfying. Or we fail or something bad happens, we get a cancer scare. And we're down in the valley, and in the valley we realize that first mountain was not our mountain. There's another mountain up ahead. And the first mountain is about acquiring, and the second mountain is about giving back. The first mountain is about going upward, but the second mountain is egalitarian, is about offering outward. And I find this pattern often in life, and often to the most amazing people you would not expect to suffer the valley in the middle of their lives. Leo Tolstoy had a great first mountain. He got out of school, he fought in duels, he was a very successful soldier, he sowed his wild oats, he tried to be a writer and came up with War and Peace and Anna Karenina, not bad. He said, looking back, that his faith in those early years was in perfecting himself. He wrote, quote, "I tried to achieve intellectual perfection. I studied everything I could. I tried to improve moral perfection. I tried to perfect my will and set up rules for myself, and I endeavored to follow. I strove for physical perfection by doing all the exercises and developing the strength. The starting point of it all was moral perfection, but this was soon replaced by a belief in overall perfection. That is, a desire to be better not on my own eyes or in the eyes of God, but rather a desire to be better in the eyes of other people. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be respected. But when he was 37, his brother died for no apparent reason, and Tolstoy could not imagine why. And then he was in Paris on a trip, and he had an experience which shook him. He went to see a public execution, a beheading. And he wrote, "When I saw how the head was severed from the body and heard the thud of each part as it fell into the box, I understood, not with my intellect, but with my whole being, that no theories of rationality, of existence, or progress could justify such an act. I realized that even if all the people in the world from the day of creation found this to be necessary according to whatever theory, I knew that it was not necessary and that it was wrong. And therefore my judgments must be based on what is right and necessary and not on what people say and do." Two things came to Tolstoy at that moment. The first was the idea of the Enlightenment project, that we could complete our salvation on earth through the force of reason, must be wrong, that there must be another source of wisdom, which is faith. And second, that there must be such a thing as eternal truth. And he came to realize that this whole perfectionism of the early half of his life had been misspent. He wrote, "My life came to a stop. I could breathe, eat, drink, and sleep. Indeed, I could not help doing these things. But there was no life in me, because I had no desires whose satisfaction I would have found reasonable." He made sure all the guns were out of the house. He stayed away from ropes. He was sick of life, and he was near suicide. Now, there's nothing intrinsically noble about suffering. Sometimes grief is just grief to be gotten through. But suffering does, or at least potentially can, have some amazingly enlightening effects. Paul Tillich, the 1950s theologian, wrote that what suffering does, or those seasons of suffering, is they make you look at yourself and they remind you you're not the person you thought you were. That what suffering does is it carves through what you thought was the basement of the floor of your soul, and carves through that floor and reveals a cavity below, and then it carves through that and reveals a cavity below. And you become aware of depths within yourself that only spiritual food can satisfy. And so you get deeper from the suffering. And what people do in those moments of suffering is dictated or prescribed in the Bible, that you go out into the wilderness. There's a story in Jewish tradition that after he had committed this perverse rebellion against one of Pharaoh's soldiers, and killed one of the soldiers in a disorganized, frankly self-indulgent way. He went out into the wilderness, and in this, Moses becomes a shepherd. And he's a shepherd for 40 years, and one of his little lambs runs away. And Moses runs after him, and usually a lamb is not that hard to catch. They don't go far, but in this story, the lamb runs like a gazelle and runs far away, and Moses has to run further and further into the wilderness to try to catch the lamb. And in rabbinic tradition, the lamb is Moses himself. He has to go deeper and deeper into the wilderness in order to realize who he is and spend a season in the desert. Belden Lane is a professor who wrote a book called Backpacking with the Saints. What happens when a gifted child, he writes, finds himself in a wilderness where he is stripped away of having to prove his worth? What does he do when there's nothing he can do? There's no audience to applaud his performance. When he faces a cold, silent indifference, if not hostility, his world falls to pieces. The soul hungry for approval starves in a desert like that. It reduces the compulsive achiever to something little, something utterly ordinary. Only then is he able to be loved. Parker Palmer had the same sort of experience. He wrote, "As the darkness began to descend on me in my early 20s, I thought I had developed a unique and terminal case of failure. I did not realize that I had merely embarked on a journey toward joining the human race." And so we normally work in ordinary time. But in the wilderness, time moves at a different pace, what the Greeks called Queiroz time. Queiroz time is like the growing of a redwood. It's long and it's qualitative, it's thick time. And it doesn't correspond to our normal sense of time. It's slower but thick, and it's the kind of time by which spiritual formation happens. And it can happen often over a long period, but sometimes suddenly an intense feeling of desolation. It's amazing to me, and I collect quotations from these people, how many of our great figures in the world have had spiritual awakenings while serving in prison. Their schedules are taken away, their contacts are taken away, material things are taken away. All they have left is their spiritual life, and they discover that's the most important thing. Dostoevsky was nearly assassinated. He was pardoned at the last moment and had a spiritual awakening that night. Anwar Sadat was in prison fighting for Egyptian independence, had a spiritual awakening. Viktor Frankl, I quoted last night, was in Auschwitz and had a spiritual awakening. Václav Havel grew up in communist Czechoslovakia, where everybody was taught that your ideas come from your material conditions, what they call material determinism. He went into prison because he was a dissident, and he was ill and nearly died. One day he was looking through the prison fence, and he saw the top of a tree. And as he gazed at this tree, as he later wrote to his wife Olga, he was, quote, "overcome by a sensation that is difficult to describe. I seemed to rise above all the coordinates of the momentary experience in the world into the same state in which all the beautiful things I had ever seen and experienced existed in a total co-present. I felt a sense of reconciliation, almost a gentle consent to the inevitable course of things. A profound amazement at the sovereignty of being became the dizzying sensation of tumbling endlessly through the abyss of its mystery, an unbounded joy at being alive, at having been given a chance to live through all I'd been lived through." He wrote, "I was struck by love, though I didn't know who or for what." And he described that as a sense of discovering transcendence. All of life up to him had told him that material things shape how we think. And he realized in that instance that's backwards, that consciousness precedes everything else. And that's what's inside precedes what comes outside. Now, I haven't had anything as dramatic as Dostoevsky and Havel and Tolstoy, though obviously I'm compared to them all the time. But I did live in my own intersection, and I have lived and still live in that weird intersection. Grew up in New York, Jewish New York, immigrant family, and as a kid, a Jewish kid in New York, you hear the stories. You hear of Noah and Ark, David and Goliath, Esther and Haman, Abraham and Isaac, the stories of your group. And for me growing up, those were wisdom literature. They were just sort of stories we heard on how to behave. Solomon is wise, David is brave, Boaz exemplifies loving kindness toward Ruth. And they were the stories that really defined who we were. For Jews, the Exodus story is the ultimate story. It is the story of spiritual formation. It is the story of a people. A pilgrimage is a journey undertaken in response to a story. And the life of the Jewish people and each individual Jew is undertaken in response to the Exodus story, the story of imprisonment, wilderness, arrival. And Jews have been telling that story and shaping their lives around that story for thousands of years, so that whether or not it actually happened has become true in the lives of so many. Even the return to the state of Israel in 1948 was the living ground of being of that story, living in history, living in people's souls, living in life. Rabbi Kook was the Israeli chief rabbi. With a penetrating consciousness, we come to realize that the essential event of the Exodus is one that never ceases at all. The public and manifest revelation of God's hand in world history is an explosion of light of the divine soul which lives and acts throughout the world. An Exodus is a spiritual formation story. When the Israelites are in Egypt, they're not ready to be a people. They're not ready to enter a covenant with God. They're in despair, they're enslaved, they're unhappy. God needs to create them into a people through the journey for them to be worthy of the covenant, for them to be capable of the covenant. He forces Moses to take on the mantle of leadership. He forces the tribes to be in relation to each other. He leads them through the wasteland. And the amazing thing about the Exodus story is that God commands the telling of the story before the actual story happens. He tells Moses, you're going to tell the story because it's in the telling of the story that the story becomes alive. And so I grew up with that story. I also grew up in a Jewish culture that was very Anglophilic. For Jews coming to America, the essence of class was Victorian England. And the culture I was raised in was, the phrase was, think Yiddish, act British. And Jews gave their young boys a lot of very English names so nobody would ever think they were Jewish. And they were names like Norman, Irving, Milton, Sidney, and Lionel. Now we all think of them as Jewish names, so it didn't really work. And so my family's version of Anglophilia was sending me to an Episcopalian school called Grace Church School on 10th Street and Broadway near the Strand bookstore. And I was in the choir, and we were about 30% Jewish in the choir. And we would sing the hymns, but to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume would drop down in the church and then come back up. But I did go to chapel every day. I did learn the Lord's Prayer. I did hear the story of Jesus, which is a story as compelling as the story of Exodus to me in those days. I mean, in some sense, it's a typical scapegoat story. The town is divided, they need somebody to blame, and so they pick a scapegoat to expunge all their sins upon. Jesus is, in some sense, a classic scapegoat, but the clever little plot twist is that he signs up to be the scapegoat, and he agrees with it, and he takes the burden on himself. For any kid, that's a moving plot twist. And so we sang the hymns. I looked up at the Gothic apse, and I went to an Episcopal camp. And I lived at the intersection of the Old and New Testament from age 4 onward. And I came, and this is sociological the way I think, I came up with these two conceptions of two versions of goodness. What I think of as classically good Jewish goodness is the kind of chesed, the loving kindness you find around a Shabbat dinner table. My general rule of thumb is that every church service is more spiritual than every synagogue service, but many Friday night dinners are more spiritual than a lot of church services. And the Jewish, you're around the table, there are 18 of you, say, and everyone's talking all at once. And they're all listening to the other 17 conversations. And they're all correcting the 17 things that were just said incorrectly. And that, to me, is a Jewish kind of goodness. But at this camp, I came into contact with another kind of goodness, which was a Christian goodness, which was a self-emptying self-love, or self-emptying love. I had a friend and a counselor there whose name was Wes Wubenhorst, and it was a camp up in Connecticut, Episcopal camp. He was a big, athletic, goofy guy who exuded joy. He would talk in this boyish way because he was just perpetually enthusiastic with pops and whistles interjecting in his conversation. And everything he said was in the nature of radical hospitality, radical self-giving love. He worked half of every year in Honduras in some very violent neighborhoods. He spent half the year in Maryland working with women who'd been beaten by their husbands. There was nothing in the physical circumstances of his life that would reflect complete joy. And yet he exuded kenosis, a sort of giving joy. His life, as Dorothy say, had the power to shock, and Christian love has the power to shock me to this day. Living, as Dorothy Day said, in a way that doesn't make sense unless God exists. And so I was on these two verges. There's a concept in history, we use the word intersection, but I like the word verge. A verge is like Istanbul, where civilizations meet. And Mako has a concept called a border stalker. And I spent all my life between the Old and the New Testament, living both sides. And it was only possible, I suppose, because I didn't think God existed, so it was only a theoretical problem. And yet there are times as you get older, even if you're not trying, where the categories of atheism become inadequate to the reality as you experience it. And you get these moments of seepage from another realm. And there are times that I have many of them. One of them Mark played a role in. I wrote a column in 2003 or 2004. I heard this name that I'd never heard before. The name was John Stott. And I looked in the page and I called up a friend of mine named Michael Cromarty and said, "Who's this guy, John Stott?" And Cromarty said to me, "If evangelicals had a pope, it would be him." So I went through the New York Times records, and John Stott's name had appeared in the New York Times once in 1957, the bottom of some pointless news story. So I wrote a column called "Who is John Stott?" just to interview to get John Stott in front of Times readers. And I read a lot of Stott over a course, and there are things that struck you about his writing, so clear and logical. Every time we look at the cross, Christ seems to be saying us, "I am here because of you. It is your sin I am bearing, your curse I am suffering, your debt I am paying, your death I am dying." Nothing in history or in the universe cuts us down to the size like the cross. All of us have inflated views of ourselves, especially in self-righteousness, until we visit a place called Calvary. It is there at the foot of the cross we shrink to our true size. And it's interesting when one of your first confrontations with intellectual Christianity is someone you'd really kind of like to be. Stott came to Washington a few months after I wrote the column and invited me to lunch, and Mark has since told me he thought a lot about that lunch. And he came at me at that lunch very forcefully. What do you believe? What's your faith journey? How is God moving in your life? He was blunt and direct, sledgehammerish often. And I was taken aback by it, and it didn't have an immediate effect, but it had some effect. And then there are other moments. I often tell the story about pulling in. I'd done my show, and I pulled into the driveway of my house, and I looked in the backyard, and I saw my kids, who were then like 4, 9, and 12, playing in the backyard with a ball, a plastic ball. And they were running across the yard, chasing it, giggling, having the most wonderful time. And so I'm confronted by this tableau of perfect family happiness. And I look it through the window of my windshield of my car, and it's as if reality is spilling outside its bounds, and you become aware of a joy that is greater than anything you experience at work, and a joy you cannot possibly deserve. And I have had since at that moment a perception that I experienced grace before I experienced God, which is perverse, but that's just the way it happened. Rabbi Heschel says, awe is not an emotion. It is a way of understanding. Awe is itself an act of insight into a meaning greater than ourselves. Abraham Joshua Heschel, another great rabbi, said, wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of the religious man's attitude toward history and nature. One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted. And as life goes on and these seepage moments begin to accumulate, you begin to see that you are normally used to the play of life. But there's an underplay going along, which is a moral drama, which is souls in conflict, souls in growth, souls in interrelationship, and that there's a spiritual play. And so I began to want to be religious. And of course, being a meritocrat, went to the University of Chicago and worked at the New York Times, I wanted to do it like homework. If I did all the reading, it would come. And so I began asking around, and when you ask Christians and saying you're on a spiritual growth, they begin sending you books. And so I got about 500 books in the course of a month, only 250 of which were different versions of C.S. Lewis' Mere Christianity. And to me, if you think about the difference between Judaism and Christianity, the big thorny spot was agency. Jews believe we co-create the earth with God. We take control. Jews are not particularly interested in heaven because heaven is perfect, so what is there to do? Christians have grace. And so Anne and I were working on this book back then, and I wanted to have like participatory grace, where you did something for God and God paid you back with grace. The whole concept of grace was very radical and very hard for me to comprehend, and Anne would write me these notes when we were working on chapters on Dorothy Day and Augustine. And here's one passage. This is what Anne wrote to me in an email and a memo about this book. Grace is the central thing Christ offers, but that is the doorway, and it is to know him. I see a lot of emphasis on striving in your note. I appreciate its antidote to cheap grace, but the foundational fact is you cannot earn your way to a state of grace. That denies grace's power and subverts its very definition. These are radical notions for somebody who grows up in the meritocratic culture of today. And so I spent the longest time hanging on the lip. If anybody reads Kierkegaard, he's an expert on getting close to religion, but not quite committing. He has this image of he's hanging from the ceiling over a swimming pool, and he's going like this, but he's not actually in the water. And he said, getting in the water is the one thing I do not have the guts to do. And so I think I spent a fair bit, and it was a gradual thing. Nobody catches faith by running after it, but nobody catches it without running after it in some way. And so the thing that happened over the next 4 or 5 years, and the best way to describe it, there was no moment, it would have been great if Jesus had walked through the door and turned my water into wine. But that never happened. But what did happen, it's like you're sitting on a train and you're talking to everybody around you and everything seems to be stable and normal. But you look out the window and you realize you've traveled a long way. And there's a lot of ground behind you. And there was not a lot of fanfare, but suddenly you're not a non-religious person. And suddenly you don't want to be and can't not be an atheist or agnostic. And so you realize you must have crossed some frontier at some point. And it can happen in the most undramatic way imaginable. And for me, frankly, it happened with Beatitudes. Romana Guardini writes, in the Beatitudes, something of the celestial grandeur breaks through. There were no mere formulas for superior ethics, but tidings of sacred and supreme realities' entry into the world. They are a miracle. And yet, I find there's only some expressions of faith that I resonate with. There's a minion of people. I think of it as the minion of people who experience faith as the way I experience it. And some of them have been Christians for a long time. One of them was Frederick Buechner, the novelist. Frederick Buechner was a writer and I think a non-believer, was walking down Madison Avenue in New York, and he happened to walk into a church and heard a sermon that Jesus spoke to us in great laughter. And he said at the phrase, "and great laughter," as he said, Atlantic rose up from the sea, he became a believer overnight. And he didn't like preachers because he said, as he wrote, they speak from their shallows and not from their depths. Good phrase. Hangs with you when you're in the bad sermons category. But he said, if you tell me that you wake up every day and God is present in your life, Buechner said, I really don't believe you. You're trying to pull the wool over your own eyes or mine. He said, you should wake up 10 days and not see anything and not feel any faith for 5 days, because that proves you're human. But if you can feel it 5 days out of 10 or 1 day out of 10, and you can do it with great laughter, then that's what faith is. Christian Wyman, whose book, My Bright Abyss, captures faith as I think a lot of us experience it, writes, Lord, I can approach you only by means of my consciousness, but consciousness can only approach you as an object which you are not. I have no experience of you as I experience the world directly, immediately, yet I want nothing more. Indeed, so great is my hunger for you, or is this evidence of your hunger for me, that I seem to see you in the black flowers mourners make beside a grave I do not know, in the bare abundance of a winter tree whose every limb is light and fraught with snow. Lord, how bright the abyss inside that seems. That concept of bright abyss is how Wyman experiences faith. And so it comes with great laughter. And so faith is change. And when you think of faith as change and perpetual movement, you realize where you've got left behind, that you've left behind a secular world and a secular worldview. You've left behind atheism. You've embraced faith in all its unexpected varieties in this weird intersection. And what you point yourself to is toward joy. And there's so many categories. Mark and I were talking about this today. Sometimes Christians feel so embattled. And first, from my point of view, growing up in a Jewish home, it's like, what are you guys complaining about? We're like 2%. But what I also see is the Christian categories and the Christian wisdom create such fullness, such an advantage. To me, the Christian schools and schools like Fuller are not embattled and behind. They're so far out ahead because they see the whole person. They see the spiritual depth of each person, and they have concepts like grace and redemption and forgiveness that are lacking and so important in a lot of the rest of the culture. But mostly what they have was joy. If you orient your life toward joy, then you're orienting it toward a true north and making the distinction, which is forgotten in a lot of the culture, between happiness and joy. Happiness is what happens when your life is going well. You achieve a victory, you get a promotion, you have an expansion of self. Joy is what happens when you experience a loss of self, when the skin barrier between you and some other person fades away and you disappear a little. I now collect passages of joy. As you can tell from my talk, I like a lot of good quotes from people wiser than myself. Some joy is just material joy. There's a great scene in Anna Karenina where Levin is cutting grass, and at first he's clumsy, but then the scythe begins to be part of his body and experiences physical flow, and that comes out as joy. Then there's the next level of joy, which is like collective effervescence. It's just dancing in uniform with other people. The novelist Zadie Smith once described being in a nightclub in London in 1999, and she was wandering about looking for her friends, wondering where her handbag was, when suddenly she could hear the hip-hop artist Q-Tip from a group called A Tribe Called Quest rapping over the music. And she wrote, "A rail-thin man with enormous eyes reached across a sea of bodies for my hand. He kept asking me the same thing over and over, 'Are you feeling it?' My ridiculous heels were killing me. I was terrified I might die. I felt simultaneously overwhelmed with delight that Can I Kick It should happen to be playing at this precise moment in the history of the world, and that I was morphing into Smells Like Teen Spirit. I took the man's hand, the top of my head flew away. We danced and we danced and we gave ourselves up to joy." And that's collective effervescence. The writer David White makes the core point about joy. It's when what seemed inside you joins with something outside of you. Joy, he writes, is a meeting place of deep intentionality and self-forgetting. Something that seemed outside but now is neither inside or outside but has become a living frontier. A voice speaking between us and the world, dance, laughter, affection, skin touching skin, singing in the car, music in the kitchen, the quiet, irreplaceable and companionable presence of a daughter, the sheer intoxicating beauty of the world inhabiting as an edge between us and what we previously thought outside of us. Wyman had his moment of joy in Prague. He was living with a young woman. He was writing poetry in the kitchen of the Prague apartment building, and he looked out the window, and there was a falcon on the windowsill on the other side of the pane. And he looked at it, and it was beautiful. It hadn't yet seen him, so he called his girlfriend. She comes running out from the shower, and they are staring at this falcon. And the falcon turns and locks eyes with Wyman. And they're transfixed by this notion of the human talking to the animal, talking to eternal life. And his girlfriend, who understood the moment, said, "Make a wish." And he wrote a poem about the experience, which includes the stanza, "And for a long moment I'm still in, I wished and I wished and I wished and I wished that the moment would not end." And just like that, it vanished. But the highest stage of joy, which is moral joy, is the kind that's not instantaneous, but is an outlook. And I meet people all the time who now have this outlook. Wes Wubenhorst, who I mentioned, had an outlook of permanent joy. We have a friend named Father Ray East, a Catholic priest in Anacostia in D.C. When he holds up the Eucharist, he has a look of permanent joy. And this kind of joy is not achieved by leaving a light life, but by taking on burdens and having a heavy life. And when the self has gone away, it is, as Gregory Boyle, who ministers to gang members here in LA, says, compassion is always at its most authentic, a shift from the cramped world of self-preoccupation into a more expansive place of fellowship. And so faith to me is looking toward joy, and it's the lure of joy. And it's living with the anticipation of joy, the twists of joy, the witnessing of joy, and you just think in the presence of that, how high are my hopes? Thanks.